The first step in actually adding more complexity to our page and designing it is to really begin to add a new set into our toolbox. I'm going to introduce you into a new element in HTML that we haven't talked about yet that's going to really help us encourage and help sort of bring a lot of that out, especially a lot of it when it comes to things like drop shadows and transparencies and colors. One of the things that I did first is I created a duplicate of the style guide page and I cleaned it really completely nice and with nothing on there. There's no HTML. There's nothing that we have in this case. You know, it's nice and clean and ready for us to play with. And you notice that when I load it in the browser, a lot of the styling that I have has come in. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce that first page element. And what it is it's referred to as a div. A div is an empty section that has really no apparent styling at all. It's actually completely empty. And this is where we're now going to be able to experiment with what this div looks like. And again, the div hasn't been styled. It's going to pick up the padding from the previous style sheet. I'll even actually expand this in full view so that we can actually begin to play with it. So I'm going to collapse these two together. And so now, of course, we've got this styling. We haven't really done anything with this div, and that really is our goal. So the one thing I'm going to do, because again, let's make sure that this div is special before we apply any things like rounded corners or drop shadows and really begin to stylize it. This is really when it becomes to be exciting. You understand that we could also add some of these core elements like drop shadows or corners into paragraph tags as well. I like to actually use them on divs because I can really sort of, there's no preconditioned styling, there's no padding. It really is a completely empty box. And that's what I love to play with. I'm going to create an ID, and I'm going to say my ID is called dropped shadow. And now I'm going to bring my ID right here. I'm going to keep it right in the front. And again, really what I want to do as I'm going away from the style guide CSS, I want to start adding a lot of my IDs possibly into a layout section. So I'm going to copy this out. I'm going to put this right here, and I'm going to call this in layout. And this is where we're going to start adding a lot of the layout techniques that we're doing. We're going to be working with a lot of really nice creative visual things. We want to be able to separate them out between where we're doing things with fonts, and again, anything that's layout related, we're going to try to keep in our div as we spoke of before. Anything that's sort of the character styles, fonts, colors, little sort of tweak variations we want to keep in classes. And of course, because as we know, CSS loads from top to bottom, I want to keep my layout elements on top, especially these core elements. Things like if a drop shadow is really critical to the design and look and feel, we want to move that all the way to the top. So I'm going to create my drop shadow ID, and I'm going to create a space. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up one of my reference library pages. One of the things that I love about CSS, and I'd say before, again, we don't really want to remember things. Even if you do, it's wonderful and amazing. I love to actually use reference examples on the web. So I'm going to come up to one of my favorite sites. It's the CSS 3.0 Maker. I have looked for it in Google, and they have a lot of 3.0 code. And so there's a great example here. There's a couple of things we're going to use in these following examples. I'm going to look for the box shadow, and it gives me a code review right here. We're just going to take the basic one, and we're going to tune the code differently. And I'm going to drop it into my ID, and I'm going to take a look at it right here. And you notice that there's a couple of lines right above it. I didn't just copy the box shadow code. I ended up copying 2 lines above it. And those 2 lines, if you realize, are very similar but quite different. The line above it is a dash MOZ dash. The second line after that is a dash WebKit dash. And one of those 2 lines that we've talked before is we've talked about cross-browser compatibility. And I said certain browsers are barely catching up. Certain browsers, are based on the same web engine that actually allows to render CSS in certain ways. In this case, because we're still waiting for some browsers to catch up, the line above is actually a reference for Mozilla. So in the Firefox browser, in order to use this code. The second line is WebKit, meaning Chrome, Safari, Opera, to say, hey, by the way, browser, if you're using WebKit, can you actually use the box shadow code? One of the things that we're going to learn is that a lot of these techniques in CSS 3.0 are really powerful and they're really amazing. But one of the things that we're going to have to learn is, in order to get full compatibility of older versions, we're going to have to add additional lines of code. What's really annoying is that as we go through the process, if I decide to change something in Chrome, I've got to actually decide to change it in these other lines of code. So we want to sort of keep ourselves, as we're opening multiple browsers, to double check that the code is actually working. Again, we're going to be looking at our Mac, we're going to be looking at the multiple browsers here, and we're also going to be looking at the multiple browsers on our PC. In this case, I've saved it into Drop Shadow. I'm going to come back into my index page. I've had the inspector before, but I'm going to reload my page, and voila, a Drop Shadow comes out. Not the most helpful in the world. Why don't we do something like, I don't know, add a little bit of padding just to begin to see how nice of an effect this is. So I've added a drop shadow. It really helps things. I might never use anything like this harsh. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to start adjusting the values. Again, we're going to adjust the values that are here. I get an ability to add actually how this looks. So controlling it from the X, the Y, the depth, and even the color. If you really want to get some more info, I always like to Google to be able to look at what other values I can manipulate. And one of the great things about tuning a page and copying code is that it's a great starting point for me to sort of play with the code. You notice that what I've been doing right now in my technique is I put it into my text editor, I reload it. One of the other great things about using the inspector, and I'm going to open up the inspector here. Let's actually blow up the page a little bit larger so you can see what I'm doing. And the inspector has an ability for me to show different elements that I'm working on. In this case, if I open up my, you notice it looks very familiar. Pretty much it's my code that I have. One of the things with the inspector is, remember, you're editing the cache. You're not actually editing any of the actual code. So usually the technique that I work is, this is a good on-the-fly technique where I can actually come in and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to adjust the padding here. And I could adjust it to, let's say, 40. I hit enter, and you notice that the div changed. If I could adjust it back to 50, and again, nothing has changed in my code. I'm just editing the inspector. I can now also come in and edit the box shadow code. So let's make this not so harsh. Maybe I'm going to change this to EEE. It's actually the same color as the background. So why don't we call it 333? And you notice that I've adjusted it. I really actually like my shadows to be a lot softer. That's kind of nice. I also might adjust some of the X and Y in depth. So the positioning, I might make this 5. You notice I've used the X. I'm going to choose 5 here. That looks kind of nice. And the depth, I might use something as 3. So again, really, really nice values that I can play with. So that's kind of, really helpful. One of the things that you'll notice in this technique is that I can see other lines of code that are actually being deprecated and not used. In this case, it's not using the MOZ box because I'm on Chrome. It's not using the WebKit because anything, especially in the Chrome inspector, anything that's overwritten gets a strikeout, even though it's red. And it really is using the box shadow code. So I can take this code right here. I can copy it. I can copy it back to my box shadow. And now, of course, I have to come back to every instance that I have just because of cross-browser compatibility. Save it. And now I can reload the page, and then now the inspector actually updates. Really cool technique. I think it's really nice. Again, it's not very dramatic, but when I do something like change my background color to white, it really helps the page pop out a lot. I actually really sometimes very, very subtly use this technique to help sort of bring things up. In the previous versions before, if we wanted to use drop shadows, we would actually have to cut a background image and make a little table and actually run the repeat X that we used before and then a repeat Y. So this is really nice. I wouldn't recommend going crazy on this technique because, again, the more effects that I add, the more processing time that the browser has to use to actually work on the page. Some mobile browsers also, I'm not big on using drop shadows, but it's a really fun technique and it kind of gives it that extra pop.